Excellent. Thank you. Cameron is our very, very trusty tech person in the background, which I owe a million gazillion dollars to for being here. So I would love to start with an opening, and I would like to invite you. Everything is as you feel comfortable, but however you are in your seat right now, if you want to find whatever is the most relaxing, whether it's both of your feet on the ground, and if you could close your eyes if you feel comfortable, or look somewhere, a soft gaze somewhere that feels comfortable. What we're going to do right now is, while we read a quote, I'm going to ask you, you'll see this picture of feet. I made up the name organ playing because this is what it makes me think of. But while we are reading a quote twice, I invite you to try, if you feel comfortable, moving your feet backwards and forwards just very slowly, as if you're playing an organ on that. And I will start. I have come to the conclusion that human beings are born with an innate capacity to triumph over trauma. I believe not only that trauma is curable, but that the healing process can be a catalyst for profound awakening, a portal opening to emotional and genuine spiritual transformation.
I have come to the conclusion that human beings are born with an innate capacity to triumph over trauma. I believe not only that trauma is curable, but that the healing process can be a catalyst for profound awakening, a portal opening to emotional and genuine spiritual transformation.
Thank you. I invite you right now, like the reason we're starting with that is to kind of get in check with our bodies as much as possible, and just to sense how that felt to sit there just for a couple of moments, moving your feet slowly as we move into this workshop today. And appreciate you for, some of this is not always comfortable. So I appreciate you for trying it out. So I'm now going to turn it over to Kelsey to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelsey Pacha. I am a white trans man. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am really excited to be here with you this morning from the West Coast. And just FYI, I don't know if you can see him. I have a little Frenchie puppy right there who is sleepy, and he's been snoring already. So if there's like a low level, like that's him snoring, and I'm trying to help him through that, but you might just kind of hear a little bit of that while I'm talking, so I'm sorry about that. So where I kind of come from in this work, I've been doing full-time training for a couple of years. My undergrad work is in like social work, qualitative research psychology, and my big focus through grad school, seminary, I have my Master of Divinity, which is the professional degree that chaplains and pastors get, but I'm not ordained or associated with a particular faith community. I have an MA in religion and psychology, and then a certificate in sexuality and religion from Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, which is like a super queer and trans-friendly seminary. So really where I come from in this work is my vocation is around healing spiritual trauma. So I find that sometimes in nonprofits and even in faith communities, it's something that's not talked about. There's not a lot of like competency around it. So I've been focusing on that work when I was a case manager, when I was working with people with disabilities, working with LGBTQ youth, certainly. So you can find a little bit more about me on this very verbose slide or on my website. I also serve as the president of Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. So we publish a 650-page book by and for trans, non-binary, gender expansive communities. So I've written the Religion and Spirituality chapter for our second edition, which is coming out next year. So I've done some academic writing, and then also regularly present on this content. And my kind of heart is for all of us to be free of the shame and guilt and the negative internalized messages that we might have gotten from faith communities. So I'm really excited to be here with you to talk about that today.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelsey. And My name is Dev Cuny, and I go by they, them pronouns. And Kelsey and I actually met in seminary together at the Graduate Theological Union, where I have an MDiv, as well as being a trained chaplain, where I worked predominantly in hospitals for a period of time. And so I come to this work from many different avenues. I currently work for an organization that does trauma-informed care, restorative practices, and social emotional learning in school districts and in schools. And so my love of restorative justice really came from the school system, but actually started in seminary, where I had the opportunity to sit on San Quentin's Restorative Justice Committee for a period of time as part of my training in prison ministry. In addition to my work actually doing restorative justice, restorative practices, I am also I guess what you would call like an ambassador for the Born Perfect campaign to end conversion therapy. And I've been working with them for about the past 5 or 6 years, where I've had the opportunity to, speak across the country and do a variety of different media outlets promoting the ending of conversion therapy, and really, really being able to emphasize just how harmful it is to all of the LGBTQ plus community, but specifically for trans and gender non-conforming, gender non-binary people, gender expansive people, which has been an extremely fulfilling ministry for me, being able to advocate for a healthier world and what I would call a healthier theology as part of that. And so I'm really excited to get to be here today. This is a passion of mine. And, it's been beautiful that Kelsey and I have been able to come together, knowing how important it is to get out the word about spiritual abuse, what it is, and how we can move beyond it and live really healthy, profoundly alive and awake and beautiful lives as, in my religious belief, God intended. So I will say, as going into the intentions today, one of the reasons I also opened with what I call a somatic exercise, the organ playing, is because, this is a heavy topic. And, sometimes, as I'm sure everyone knows from their own experience, we don't know when something's going to come up and be activating, or, a memory that might be painful. And so I want to be clear that we are working to be very intentional in this workshop to manage how deep or how far we go into certain subjects, knowing that we only have so much time together and that we are not a therapeutic setting. And so we don't, we want to be very careful of what I would say our souls, but also our nervous systems. So if for any reason something does come up, because stuff just comes up, like, I just want to make sure that, you can do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to leave the workshop, come back in, turn off your camera, take a walk around and come back, whatever it works. And then if, you want, you might find actually going into that slow somatic movement helpful, with just trying to find, this is a grounding exercise and trying to find some balance. But whatever it is, your body more than anyone. And we just welcome you to take care of yourself as needed. And so just going into what I'd call the intentions today, what our hope for going through is, one, just an overall understanding of what spiritual trauma is. Like, what is it exactly? A lot of people have experienced this, but don't even know that there's a name, for what this is. And then we're going to talk, and about theological messages around it, both positive and challenges that come with that. And then we're going to go into interventions and different ways to work with spiritual trauma, which will enter into one of the main practices or interventions we're going to be talking about, is actually restorative practices. And so we will talk about what restorative justice is as a whole, the history, how it can be used in different ways. And then finally, we will have the opportunity to do what I call restorative conversations, which is putting all of this together and being able to have a chance to get to know each other more and to talk a little bit more about, how this fits into our world and our lives. So with that, we're going to do a technology change of switching slideshows real quick, but I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey, who will get us started.
Wonderful. And Dev, if you can stop your share, that will allow me to share, I believe. Thank you. And just to give a little bit of overview, so kind of what I'm going to do for the next, let's say 30-ish minutes, is give sort of an overview of, like, what do we know in terms of research, what has been written about kind of our experiences of religion and spirituality in general as trans, non-binary, gender expansive people. And the purpose of that is to really hone in on how few resources there are, and to give us a little bit of a landscape and some language that could help us to describe our own experiences. So even though this might seem kind of lecture-y at the beginning, I really invite discussion. So whether that's through the chat or whether you want to unmute and just say sort of like, hey, excuse me, I have some feedback on that, or I have, you know, something I'd like to share, a story I'd like to share. So because I think that a lot of what has struck me in doing work on spiritual trauma and abuse and naming that, like especially for providers, because a lot of the trainings that I do are for therapists, for teachers, right, for doctors, nurses, is getting people to understand the different ways that religion and spirituality can operate in LGBTQ people's lives. And beyond that, there are differences, meaningful differences between queer people's experiences that are centered around theological messages around sexuality versus transgender, expansive, non-binary people's experiences, which are centered around gender. And that theology has changed. So I think that it's important that we are able to identify for ourselves and share with each other, like, what does this look like? Like, what have we observed? Because we are the ones who are ultimately creating the resources now that the folks that come after us can lean on. So just as an overview of what we know research-wise about the health effects, so like, how does religion and spirituality affect our mental health, affect our overall health and well-being? For the general population, meaning just all the people, there are salutary or health promoting effects. So folks that are religious, and this can be measured in different ways, whether we say, I'm identified as a Catholic, as a Muslim, as a non-denominational Christian, etc. It could be we attend some kind of service or group, or that the ideas of religion are important to us, which is called religious salience. Those three measures create what's called religiosity measure. And so people who are religious, who score high on religiosity, tend to heal quicker from illness, report less pain. Like if someone has a chronic, has a condition that causes chronic pain, they report less pain. They're able to make more meaning out of their experiences, and they feel supported by a community. So they may have a group of folks that's praying for them, or just knowing that they have a community that could help make them meals, etc., promotes mental health and well-being. As you might guess, for LGBTQ people, that relationship is a little more complicated. And frankly, most of the research on LGBTQ people is really on LGBTQ people. So it's really centered around sexuality. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll get into. But the relationship between trans and gender expansive people's relationship with religion, spirituality, mental health, overall health is complex. So this Barnes and Meyer study out of the Williams Institute, out of UCLA, they do a lot of like LGBTQ research. They were comparing LGB people who regularly attended a religious service where they were hearing negative messages. So this could be hearing like anti-gay sermons, or doing some kind of text study that was focused on an anti-queer message. They compared that group of people with a group of people that didn't attend any kind of religious service at all, LGBT people that didn't attend a religious service. And they measured the difference between those two groups of depression, internalized homophobia, and self-esteem. And they hypothesized, well, the folks that are regularly hearing these negative messages about their identity are going to have lower self-esteem, higher measures of depression, and more internalized homophobia. And they found that 2 out of 3 of those were true. So the folks that were regularly hearing these anti-queer faith-based messages did have higher levels of internalized homophobia. They did have slightly lower self-esteem, but their depression levels were pretty equal. And that really surprised them. And so they kind of think that that is because there still is this health promoting benefit of being part of a faith community, even when we are hearing negative messages about ourselves. And this is really important because, number one, This study is one of the only studies that has methodologically been really sound from the Williams Institute on this subject, and because it seemed like a pretty like cut and dried case going into it. We might be able to think to ourselves, oh, sure, I attend this church, that's my family church, because, you know, my parents accept me or love me, but I know that I might hear things that are contrary to my identity when I go. And I'm okay with that because I have this other group that I lean on, right? So we might anecdotally understand that, but this is important because it really goes against kind of what we understand about religion and spirituality's effect on health as a whole. So to get a little bit more detailed about this, when we're looking at trans and gender expansive people and our religious like behavior, there are high rates of religious disaffiliation, which just means we're raised in a certain religion as children, and over time as adults, we disaffiliate. We no longer identify with that religion. Certainly, some transgender expansive people experience some kind of conflict between their religious or spiritual identity and their gender identity, which can cause psychological distress, whether that's anxiety, depression, isolation. This is experienced by youth as well, and many youth are regularly attending services and not knowing whether their community is accepting or not. That's borne out in some of the recent HRC youth surveys. And critically, there are potentially higher rates of religious-based rejection for trans and gender expansive people as compared to lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer people. So this data comes from the US Trans Survey. 13% of trans folks in that survey, it was a sample of 27,000 folks, the largest quantitative study that we have, were pressured by some kind of a professional to stop being transgender, and 4% were religiously based. So that could be like religious counselors or folks that are trying to do reparative therapy. But it's important for us to understand that even though there are some really common theological messages about gender and sexuality that may be leveraged against us at different times in our lives as transgender expansive people, that sort of the way that theological development and activism have developed, as well as just kind of the coreness of gender to a lot of religious institutions, makes it so we are often more threatened and higher levels of rejection than LGBTQ people. So what's also important to understand is, so that's kind of talking about some of the individual effects, right? Like what do we internalize and what happens to our self-concept when we're experiencing that kind of oppression. But this also shows up on a social or a systemic level. So religious affiliation and religiosity are correlated with family rejection. So family rejection is what it sounds like. It's caregivers and parents who reject young people, sometimes adults, but most of the research is about rejecting young people on the basis of their sexuality or gender. And family rejection is associated with increased suicide attempts, risky sexual behavior, depression, substance use, homelessness. So 40% of LGBT homeless youth are on the streets due to family rejection. That's one estimate. This photo on this slide is from a Rolling Stone article that's specifically about religious-based family rejection that leads to homelessness. So it's important to understand that whenever we're talking about some of the more like population level negative health effects for our communities, which includes not being housed, right? Because that leaves us open to all kinds of ways of being exploited, right? That is associated with religion in some way, with being religiously involved. Furthermore, religiously based anti-trans rhetoric in the media or in politics is linked to negative mental health effects. And that's true both for us, if we're part of the community as transgender expansive people, but also for our families. And sometimes that kind of crisis can lead to a change in religious affiliation for our families. So again, these things might be kind of obvious to us if we've experienced it, excuse me, but it's important to know that this is borne out in the research as well. Now, as we might kind of assume, the other kind of systemically oppressive dynamic that happens in a lot of LGBTQ research is that it's done by white researchers about white populations. There's some evidence that transgender expansive people of color negotiate their religious identities differently So that can show up in a couple of ways. One is that because of white supremacy within specifically Christianity, there are many Black-led churches and Black denominations that came out of racist denominations, right? 100, 200 years ago, even more recently in some cases. Those faith communities often are bastions against white supremacy in the culture. So there are some people of color who feel like they have to choose between being out and open and being supported by a mostly white, let's say, Christian inclusive, LGBT inclusive community, and their family church or their church that is based in race, ethnicity, culture, that serves the purpose of insulation from white supremacy, which they might experience in that white inclusive faith community, if you're following me here. So that puts an extra burden of marginalization onto trans people of color. There's potentially less institutional support because if you're looking at a big denomination like the United Church of Christ, which is very progressive, Unitarian Universalism, even Episcopalians, right? They have their own nonprofit network that is about LGBTQ inclusivity. So they might have staff that full-time are answering questions, supporting congregations, creating curriculum and training, right? For communities that are based in a geographical area or in communities of families, they're not necessarily going to have those curricula that are specifically addressing the needs and concerns of that community. Trans people of color are more likely to have been part of a faith community, to have feared rejection, and to have actually experienced rejection. That comes out of the US Trans Survey. Perhaps there are some dynamics related to gender roles, that there's some kind of pressure within LGBT inclusive POC-led communities to have masked femme couples, or there's some kind of mandate from sacred text about masculinity and femininity that is different than other kinds of more like radical queer theologies. I think that's kind of contentious, but that's, you know, kind of what the research says as of now. McQueenie, Kristen McQueenie, the second bullet point, did a study of a Black lesbian-led Christian community in Georgia and did qualitative interviews with this congregation of several dozen folks, and found that those folks not only were very invested in the community that they created specifically for Black, lesbian, queer women, but they often did a thing they called double dipping, which was that they attended their POC inclusive community, and they also attended their family church or their childhood religious community of origin. And they did that for the reasons that I described, of keeping connection with family, of keeping connection to culture and a specific kind of a theology. So I think it's really important to note that that there are different kinds of negotiations we might make based on our multiple identities. So now just to define, I mean, maybe I'll pause for a moment and just see if anyone wants to share anything or see kind of how that lands. You know, does this feel like it's hitting a note of truth? Does this feel like it's not so straightforward? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Okay. So to define spiritual abuse, which often is a precursor to a traumatic reaction, right? So spiritual abuse is what it sounds like. It's the mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment with the result of weakening, undermining, or decreasing that person's spiritual empowerment. So any kind of power dynamics that exploit someone, manipulate someone in terms of their spiritual connection, which may or may not be within a religious community, right, is spiritual abuse. And it can happen for all kinds of reasons. Religious abuse focuses more on the institutional piece of it, right? So when a religious group or leader uses their power within an organization to oppress or manipulate their victim with their own beliefs. So this is kind of the difference between religion and spirituality, right? Religion is more about the institution and the structure. Spirituality can be part of that, but it's more of that individual journey. Spiritual trauma is trauma that's root is within a spiritual community, from a faith leader, or from a belief system, like from a theology. Trauma is a reaction. So if we're talking about that clinically, right, we're talking about folks having flashbacks, feeling like they're taken within to a memory and they can't get out of it, or they can't distinguish in that moment between reality and this memory. Hypervigilance, so feeling like you have to protect yourself all the time, that you're on high alert. And sometimes that can be developmentally stuck, right? So a traumatic reaction can result from abusive experiences, but doesn't always. Trauma can also result just from a chronic exposure to harmful dynamics and beliefs. So spiritual trauma has been referred to in many different ways. It kind of comes out of recovery communities and is just now starting to be referred to in like social science research. So Marlene Winnell wrote a book called Leaving the Fold, which I recommend as a resource. She works with a lot of people who leave like really insular faith communities like cults, and looks at the mental health effects of that. She has this term religious trauma syndrome, which is a constellation of trauma responses related to both the chronic abuses of harmful religion and the impact of severing the connection with one's faith. So I think that it's important to realize, even if we are, let's say, 45 years old, and it's been 25 years since we've been a part of a certain faith community, if we grew up with certain kinds of beliefs that told us we're going to hell, we're intrinsically bad, we're doomed, right? We can still have panic. We can still have traumatic responses when we're exposed to that kind of theology. We can still feel very negatively about ourselves, have shame and guilt, because we internalize that belief, even if presently our adult selves say, I don't even believe in that anymore. I don't even believe in God. So there's also a psychiatrist named Daryl Ray who focuses on working with people that have left religion. And he has observed that folks that disaffiliate from a faith community might experience anxiety and depression for 2 to 3 years afterwards, and might spend 5 or more years recovering from a fear of retribution, death, and hell. And he doesn't specifically focus on working with LGBTQ people, but we can certainly see kind of why that would come. From our specific kinds of theological exposures. So sources of spiritual trauma can include just the theology itself of kind of whatever faith community we come from, direct abuse by a religious or spiritual figure, vicarious trauma from the culture. So we discussed that a little bit. How do we get talked about in politics, and then that leads to our rights being limited, or having religious addict caretakers, or just caretakers who use, for whatever reason, religion or spirituality to control us or to manipulate us as children. What distinguishes spiritual trauma from other kinds of trauma, right? So there can be a feeling like God's presence or God's power, if we grew up with a God, that God's presence is inescapable. Today might be the day that I'm struck by lightning because I came out, right? That could be a belief that we have. Spiritual trauma can be developmentally stuck in the way that I described before. We no longer hold the belief that is traumatizing us in some way. It disrupts the possible positive coping that we could have within a faith community or within a spiritual practice because we're too afraid to go there. It disrupts family and social support structures. So there's a lot of support that can happen, whether it's food pantries, meal trains, prayer chains, right? There are certain kinds of material support that come through faith communities that we won't have access to if we are not able to be involved because we feel traumatized. I really like this quote. This is from Thomas Doyle, who writes about Catholic sex abuse and the ways that was systemically allowed. And he said, the power that has been abused in those situations is a spiritual power that allows a person to enter into the secret lives of others. So if we think about ourselves as having received spiritual counsel, having told some of our deepest secrets to someone, and then they out us in front of the entire faith community that we're part of, or in a newsletter, or tell us that we can't come back or that we have to repent publicly, what does that do to the very sacred relationship we had between that person as a vessel of the divine? So there are certain, and I know I'm going a little bit quickly, but I wanted to give a little overview of some really common theological messages that I've seen that kind of roughly correlate to certain kinds of mental health outcomes. And I'm doing this not as like an intellectual exercise, but really to hopefully provide some validation, because I think that a lot of times within LGBTQ communities, there can be a sense of folks that have completely left faith that, well, we know that religion is evil, right? Oh, you know that God is not real, so why can't you move on? There can be a complete invalidation of our real need for healing within ideas that are still important to us in some way. So a lot of us have probably heard this term abomination. So if we're looking at like Judeo-Christian communities who are looking at the Hebrew scriptures in Leviticus or Deuteronomy. So granted, we can get into toeva as the Hebrew translation and what does that actually mean, but a lot of anti-trans faith adherents might use that word of abomination to tell us that there's something wrong with the way that we are. So we are not as God intended in some way, right? Because we are transgender or non-binary or gender expansive. So this word abomination it's kind of the difference between shame and guilt. So shame is I am wrong. Abomination is I am wrong. So we can feel like we're not meant to be here, that we're intrinsically evil, that we're sick, that we're perverted, which can manifest into shame, into self-hatred, depression, etc. Condemnation is sort of the opposite. So condemnation is about what am I doing? What are the choices that I'm making? So I'm choosing to be transgender. I'm choosing to be queer. I'm choosing to be non-binary. And that choice is going to send me to hell. There's some kind of consequence for this inevitable choice I have to make about my identity. So this comes through with any kinds of writings about the afterlife that are punishing. Condemnation is more of the guilt part, like I did something wrong, I keep doing something wrong. So this kind of guilt can manifest in a feeling of doom, of folks sometimes being in abusive situations and feeling like they deserve it. Just typing in the chat, it's Marlene Winnell is the author. So condemnation can result in sort of a self-defeating, self-fulfilling prophecy. Isolation, so those are abomination and condemnation, I think, whether we're looking at Judeo-Christian communities, which are most, what I've worked with the most in the US, even when we're looking at other major world religions, these two kinds of messages are really common for LGBTQ people. What's more insidious that we don't often think about is the lack of positive messaging from our faith communities, right? So growing up in a community where trans people were never talked about, gender nonconforming people, even if they're cis, they're not really addressed as being part of the divine story, as being sacred and inherently dignified. So not having positive representations can make us feel like I'm the only one. I'm the only one who's like this. Maybe I wasn't made this way or intended this way. I will never find community. I'm all alone. And that kind of isolation, we know, leads to suicidal ideation, depression, self-hatred, etc. Other kinds of messages that we might receive from faith communities are that we can be fixed. So our gender identities can be changed through prayer, through ritual, laying on of hands, exorcisms. We might be told that we can't continue the family line if we change our gender or change our bodies in some kind of way. We'll lose a connection to ancestors. We can lose certain kinds of access to a spiritual line because our gender changes. We might hear that we just have an imbalance of masculine and feminine energies, and if that were corrected, we wouldn't want to transition. Sometimes faith communities label being LGBTQ as a secular phenomenon and sometimes a white phenomenon. So this isn't something that is of God, this is of the world, is a message that I've heard. And all of this can cause anxiety, stress, trauma, social isolation, right? Because we might want to be connected and have really good relationships to our families or to our faith communities we want to maintain outside of this powerful message, negative message. I think it's important to name, as just the last piece of this, that anti-trans theology has evolved as of late. So it used to be, and I don't know, maybe Dev could speak to this. We're not really talking a lot about conversion or reparative therapy, but it used to be that when faith-based groups claimed that they could change someone's sexuality, they really clung on to two ideas. One was that the person needed to identify more with their opposite sex parent. So there was some kind of rupture between that parent-child relationship that causes the child to seek out the validation and affirmation from the same sex because they didn't get it from their opposite sex parent. They can say it either way, but that's one way. The other being that there's some kind of, that person just needs to become more gender conforming. So if we train this boy who wants to wear dresses, to play sports, and to lift weights, you know, and to be more macho, his sexuality will change, which is a conflation of sexuality and gender, right? Now, anti-trans, especially Christian communities, are becoming a little bit more sophisticated, and they're relying more on this philosophical idea that biological sex equals God's will for our lives. So you'll see in this graphic, there's this book called When Harry Became Sally, which is just one of the most, just the strangest anti-trans theological book titles that I've seen. You'll see that the tagline for this book is a sound, compassionate response to the transgender movement. So you can imagine a parent seeing this book and thinking like, oh, okay, I've got a kid who's saying maybe they don't identify with their sex assigned at birth. I should look into this because this is sound and compassionate. While they're coming from this place of believing that biological sex is our sacred destiny. I just want to note also that this graphic with the X and Y chromosome is completely scientifically inaccurate. The Y chromosome is much, much smaller than the X chromosome. And I think that tells you everything about this person's understanding of gender and biological sex. So trans-specific theological concerns that, that a lot of anti-trans faith-based folks are saying now, gender confusion is a result of the fall. So it's just one more manifestation of sin in the world. If someone transitions, especially medically, that's a mutilation of God's creation, surgical interventions or hormones. It challenges God's power or God's sovereignty. It encourages non-heteronormative sexuality. So some folks think, oh, if this person has surgery and they pass as their true gender, they're going to be straight identified and we're never going to know, and they're going to fold into society. And what they're actually doing is they're being homosexual, and they're involved in homosexual behaviors, but they're being secret about it. And lastly, folks think like that a lack of parental leadership regarding gender is child abuse, meaning that parents that support their young transgender expansive children in transition or living as their authentic selves are not listening to God, and that in and of itself is abusive. So that's important, I think, for us to know in terms of responding, that it's resting on this really shaky philosophical ground. So how do we respond? In a longer training, there would be a lot more discussion and activity around this, but what kind of interventions can we think about if we're working with people, not just ourselves, on spiritual trauma and abuse? So it's important for us to do self-reflection if we are pastoring someone or if we are providing therapy to someone or other kinds of support, that we know exactly what our stuff is, what our negative stuff is. Where are we going to get triggered? Where are we going to over-identify with someone because of their spiritual journey? Inviting and helping clients have a sense of critical consciousness about their faith, meaning let's actually look at the historical context of the book of Leviticus. Let's actually look at the Hebrew or the ancient Greek in Paul's letters. Let's actually talk about, from a Christian context, of course, let's actually talk about the nuts and bolts of where these messages come from. There are so many transgender expansive sacred figures in every tradition that I've looked at. There's a book called Cassell's Encyclopedia of Queer Myth and Symbol. It's out of print now, but you can find it online. I recommend that in the resources. It's got hundreds of entries from every tradition that you can think of. We are often viewed as sacred and having special powers. So having affirming messages that we can we can reinforce to ourselves and also to the people that we love and support. Reclaiming our faith, finding networks that are supportive to us, finding resource figures, and recognizing that sometimes that kind of supportive community might not be actually a religious or spiritual community. Maybe there's a recovery community, or there is a book club that feeds that spiritual part of ourselves. So how can we access who we are as divine beings, not necessarily within a faith community itself? So I'm going to turn it over to Dev to talk about restorative practices as one more of those interventions that can be really effective for helping to heal our spiritual trauma.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Kelsey? Okay, awesome. Doing a little switcheroo. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for sharing more about spiritual and religious trauma, and including some really important interventions. And this goes into talking about restorative practices, and you'll hear me talk about restorative justice and restorative practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about the distinction. But what I would love to know at this point is kind of how much you know about restorative practices, because it is a topic that some people have heard about, but may not know. So on a scale of 1 to 4, 1, you may have heard of it, but you don't know anything, to 4, that you're an expert or somewhere in between, would you please put in the chat box where your knowledge is, how much you feel you know about it? Two, 3, excellent. 4, okay. Yeah, we're pretty, yeah. 3, 4, good. It looks like everyone has, some knowledge of it. Some people are more familiar than others, but this is a really great, it looks like everyone's heard of it. So wonderful. Thank you for taking time to do that. I want to go into, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview about what restorative practices is right now. But to be clear, because we have such a short period of time, this is seriously like a snapshot of it, because this is a very expansive topic with a lot to it. And so, if you are interested in learning more about it, I call this wet your whiskers. It's like, I want to show you the beauty in the power of restorative practices so that you want more, and that you are going to want to seek it out and see how it could be beneficial for your life or for people who you're serving or supporting. And so, going into it, just talking about a little bit of the history of restorative justice, it is something that came up again, I will say, in the 1970s through the criminal justice system. So a lot of people associate restorative justice as a mediation process that's in the criminal justice system. But I feel like it is extremely important when talking about restorative justice to really, really be clear about where it really comes from, which has been throughout all of time, from indigenous cultures. And I'd like to state, Kelsey and I both are on Ohlone land right now, which is a tribe that used practices within restorative justice, healing circles, in order to heal from, within a community, in order to resolve conflict. So this is not, even though this has become a hot topic more and more in recent times, in no way is this a product of United States culture or the criminal justice system. This is something that has been used and borrowed, and that's super important. And so one person who has really, really helped put restorative justice on the scene again within our society is Fania Davis. And some people who may or may not know Fania is Angela Davis's sister. And so she's in the Bay Area and has been a real key part of the work that I've done and the work that we're doing in this world. And she will talk about and make it clear that RJ is more than conflict resolution. It's actually a way of life inspired by indigenous worldviews. One great example of aspects of restorative justice being used are healing circles, is called the Hollow Water First Nation community. They were in need of trying to figure out why there was so much alcoholism in their community and how to address it. So they started engaging in healing circles. And for those who may or may not know about what restorative justice is, it's oftentimes seen in a circle where people sit around in a circle and you have a talking piece and you pass a talking piece around and each person has an equal opportunity to be able to share whatever the topic is. And so the Halawadu First Nation community started having these healing circles with the talking piece. And while they were talking about alcoholism in their community, what happened is there was a revealing of sexual abuse that was also happening in the community. So this type of circle became an opportunity to also heal around sexual abuse in it. So that's just one example of how it can be used. But as I'm talking, I keep going back and forth between, again, restorative justice, restorative practices, restorative culture, so there's a lot of different words that can get really confusing. So I just want to break it down first that, restorative justice, the phrasing that is most heard, I look at that as a reaction to harm that has been caused. And so this is the most known one where, again, like I said, it's like in a mediation. So say someone has caused a crime, and they are in prison and they would like to have a series of conversations with the people they harmed, which could be an individual, a family, a whole community. If that community or that person who has been harmed agrees to this and it makes sense and it's safe, they can go into a series of conversation where the person who has caused the harm has an opportunity to take accountability and really provide the truth and be there to witness the people who they've harmed's pain, and also be there to hear about the wounds that they have caused and what they might need through this process in order to help with the healing. And so I want to be very clear when talking about this, when translating into what we're talking about with spiritual abuse and trauma abuse. This is a very, very structured process that we are definitely not going to be going into today, what I would call a harm circle. Because as you can imagine, there's a lot that can come up in that kind of circle. One of the things being power dynamics and being able to understand really what it takes for people to be ready to do it. So this takes a lot of training, which again is why if you are interested in learning more about this, I would love to actually get your email address at the end so we can plug you into being able to explore that more in depth, because that can be an extremely healing process, but also it can be a harmful process when it's not done right. So today the focus is more on healing conversation. So I can't emphasize that enough, but that is generally what restorative justice is seen at in our society, is a healing harm circle where there's a process that is hopefully about accountability, consequences that are appropriate, and then finally, only when it makes sense, and it's definitely not part or required, sometimes there is forgiveness and reconciliation. But again, sometimes this can be misused where people think, and it's, that restorative justice means everyone's going to be forgiven, everyone's going to come back into a restored relationship. That is not the case. That's not the point. Sometimes that happens, but at its root, the goal is to help heal the harm that has been caused to those who have been harmed. So then we go into restorative practices and culture. This is where I see it as a more proactive, systemic, cultural philosophy and framework of focusing relationships at the center of everything that we do. So, in the school system, they will practice restorative practices. And so, old school, the way that consequences and punishment has been done in the school system throughout time has been punitive, which means there's a crime or a harm done, and then you get punished, end of story. So restorative practices and culture switches that in saying that even the person who has caused the harm is worthy of dignity and is worthy of being able to be understood. But really, it's welcoming the process of understanding what were their deeper intentions. And with that process of how can we see how healing can be done through relationships. So for example, if a harm has been done in the school system and you just throw the book and do put punitive punishment, there's no space that has been created for the person who has been harmed to be able to actually speak up and speak about the harm and heal. So restorative culture really, really is central on relationships, understanding that there are emotions, experiences, and many different factors that can cause a situation. And so finally, because I want to be aware of my time, I'm allowing myself some fun talking about this. is restorative conversations. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. And so restorative conversations can be in a circle talking with a talking piece, but it can be as little as two people who are sharing in some similar topic. It can also be that there has been a harm caused between the two, but the framework in which to have this conversation is focused on empathy, and again focused on relationships and healing and problem solving. And I want to emphasize taking responsibility and making amends. And so you know that is what we'll be talking about. Again, if you want to learn about the other stuff, please let us know. Please drop your email address in, and I would love to geek out with you and talk about other trainings and possibilities for you to learn more about restorative conversation. So with that, the question of how can restorative practices support people who have experienced spiritual trauma? First and foremost, it is designed and set up to build relationships and community. Again, relationships are at the center. We see every person in that circle as, what I would say, this is my language from my spiritual background, as God's creation, and so it also sets up, a collaborative and inclusive environment. It centers the dignity of people involved. It encourages sharing feelings within a safe space to be actively listened to in hopes of healing and transformation. Accountability, understanding, and healing, like I said. But I also want to jump down to mutual aid. So this is a quote I really love that describes mutual aid. And I'm going to read it now. So when we are in a relationship of mutual respect and equality, when the connection is between two peers struggling along the same road together, working to love one another, we can become powerful and beautiful beyond measure. And I believe that mutuality can transform patients into people and restore health beyond expectation. More than this, I also believe that as people come into wellness and self-love, society can be transformed. So, for those of you who probably know something about mutual aid, but just to be clear, it is the belief that when people come into a community and share something that they have in common, or sit there to witness each other's life and pain, that healing can happen. And I think about this, again, there are healing circles all around the world. One of the most obvious ones that comes to my head is, can be like the 12-step program model, which is not just limited to 12-step by any means, but it's when people can come into a community with a common goal and theme and be able to witness without judgment and with empathy and understanding, that healing can happen. So before we jump into this, I would love to ask one more time, after going through this process of learning more about spiritual and religious trauma, what kind of music do you feel like now, as we're about to go into trying conversations? If you could add it to the chat box. Sad indie, yes. R&B. I think hopeful blues, I like that. I think for myself, I'm feeling a little bit like jazz suddenly. I started off with walking on sunshine, and now it feels a little bit more focused. Improvisation for strings, awesome. Thank you all. And again, just at the beginning, and for some of you who came in late, jazz improv, thank you. I'm asking this question because I love music, one, but also because a key part with this kind of work is being in touch with where we're at. And so asking that question is just to take a temperature check and kind of like a body scan of where you are emotionally as we go into this a little bit more. And so with this, I would like to go into guidelines about what we're about to do, which is to have and practice restorative conversations. And first and foremost, like I said at the beginning, this is just about being able to track yourself and to feel comfortable and safe. So as we go into this, I just really encourage you to keep checking in with yourself. And if you feel yourself getting activated, to yourself better than anyone, and your body wisdom to take care of yourself as you need, which might be to pause, to take to turn off the video camera, to say or to pass, whatever you need. And so when entering into this conversation, these are some guidelines that I am going to throw out to use. If you have any you want to add or subtract or change, please add to the chat box as I'm doing this, because I would love to know. And so going into it, the first one is participation is optional. I can't emphasize this enough. A lot of times when restorative conversations are done, or restorative justice circles, people think it's a mandatory that people have to speak out, and that's not it. This is work that has to come willingly from the heart, and to feel safe enough to do it. So if you're in this group, I would encourage you to try to share, but if you find yourself not in that space, that's all right. So the next one is speaking from the I. Sometimes when we're talking about conversations, it can be easy to start talking from a we perspective, given one of our identities. But I really encourage like talking from the I and using feeling words when talking, which really makes it clear that this is an individual experience. And then people understand that they are here to witness your personal experience and beliefs from that. The next one is about confidentiality. What is said here stays here. And then also just being aware of your positionality and checking your privilege. We all come in with many different identities, with many different, positions in our society, and that means different levels of privilege. So when we are talking, just asking to really, really be aware as much as you're able of who you are, what identities you bring in, and also how that impacts other people based on your own life experiences and limited life experiences. And then finally, no crosstalk. So one of the reasons that we will use talking pieces, and even though we don't have a talking piece today because this is virtual, is that is telling people that it is sacred time for that person to speak when they have that stick. And that means everyone is there to listen actively and not to interject, but just to me, create a sacred space and bear witness. So how this is going to go for the restorative convos, we're going to break up into small groups. And a suggested format is that, oh, and Kelsey, if you could add the question, into the chat box. We're going to have a few questions which we'll go through. But like one person, as a suggestion, could read the question out loud. I would then suggest take a pause for a moment to think. And then, if you need help, like in which order to go in, you can go in alphabetical order by first name. It's just an easy way to get it started. After each question, take a moment to pause and breathe a couple of times and just steady, before going in and kind of giving what I'd call a sacred pause between questions. We will give you time warnings as you go into this. But if you have questions or anything, please come back, ask us questions, send us, that would be great. And if you end early, like some people really enjoy just continuing to chat with the people they're with, or you're welcome to come back to the main room and join us, and that would be wonderful too. And finally, again, take care of yourself. And I put the picture of the feet one more time, just to remind you that you might want to try using this tool, if that helps you just kind of stay present with yourself during it. So the questions today that we're going to go through is, one, please share your name and why you chose to take this workshop out of all workshops today. And then like the next part is just going into what was your relationship like with religion growing up? And then also, what's it like today? And I want to emphasize there are no wrong answers, again, because there's no crosstalk and we're here just to witness your truth. You can say whatever you need to say, that is true for you, and that is honored in this restorative conversation. And then finally, what does it mean and feel for you to see transgender identities as sacred for yourself, families, and friends, however you feel led to answer that? And the final thing I'll say with this is because this is not a therapeutic circle, I kind of say on a scale of like 1 to 10, when sharing something, to kind of check in. Like a 10, might be really, really activating, like really might stir up stuff. And I would maybe encourage you to pause at, like sharing the 10 thing in case you might need to have care afterwards. And I will say, I am happy to stay, to reach out afterwards if you want to talk or anything. But I kind of look at like, when sharing, just to consider that kind of middle ground, something that might challenge you if you feel safe enough, that might stir stuff, but is not so triggering that it could take you out of the circle altogether. So with that, I would love to just get into this. And Kelsey is going to be breaking up everyone into small conversations. And I look forward to talking to you all on the flip side.
Welcome back, everyone. I know that that was not enough time. I'm sure that there were good conversations happening. I wanted to, we've only got a couple minutes left. I am putting an eval in the chat. It's just a Google form that we made. If you could just take a couple seconds, it's got like 3 open-ended questions, and just give us a little feedback. It helps us to make this even better. Obviously, we wish we would have had more time. And thanks for your time.
And I would love just to close out the conversation if you could also just put in the chat box like how you're feeling right now. It can be music again if you like, or anything that you want. Like inspiring, empowering. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. Happy, real connected scene. It's awesome. Thank you. Heart-filled. Yeah, as we're closing out, like, you know, with a circle, there is an opening, a building in, and part of a circle or conversations is taking you deeper and deeper and deeper to the heart. And so, like, I don't have time to really kind of talk too much about this, but even the way this workshop is designed was to take it deeper and deeper. And so the closing of being able to share how you were and feeling and to say thank you in a way, you know, and a final checkout is how we exit these kind of conversations. Thank you, Michael. Oh, that's wonderful. And so with that, I would like to formally close out. Kelsey, like, this is a quote that to close the circle.
Yeah, so this is from our colleague Ashley Moore. Transgender persons seem to be an acutely spiritual people. Perhaps this is because once you reach the point of saying who you are transcends your physical form, then you are immediately aware of yourself as a spiritual being. And that's from the book Transgendering Faith.
We have sent out, like, you know, there's resources that we have, like, that you put in the chat box, right, Kelsey? Or is that?
I am putting that in right now.
Excellent.
So you'll have these slides.
And these are all the resources that, thank you so much. If you want additional, and again, like, if you can, if you're interested, please put your email in the chat box and we can, you know, send you information. You can reach out to us as well, which, do you want to say, oh wait, I'm just speeding through because we have 1 minute. I'm going to turn this to Kelsey real quick.
No worries. I just wanted to mention that Dev and I are working on a longer form cohort-based version of this. That would be like 6 weeks, 3 to 4 hours per session online. It would be free. If you're interested in that, please either drop your name in the chat box or email us directly. Part of what will help us make it happen is like demonstrating that we have a group of people who really want to make it happen. So we would just email you, get some availability, but we have some really exciting stuff, and we know like now more than ever, it's so important to be able to talk about this pain that, and this, you know, the pain that some of us carry, especially during this political time. So if you're interested, please let us know, and we really hope to hear from you. Also, you can feel free to email either of us if you have questions on the content or other resources. If I can speak for Deb, either of us would be happy to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, thank you so much. We're at time. I am big on respecting time. I appreciate you all for taking the time to do this workshop and look forward to hearing from you. I hope the rest of your day is meaningful and that you get to continue to connect with others through this beautiful conference. So thank you. And thank you, Cameron, for your help today.